The fluorescent lights hummed like hornets trapped in plastic cages. Margaret Walsh clocked in at 10:22 p.m., 7 minutes before the night shift officially began, the way she always did. Early. Quiet. Invisible. She pulled her graying hair tighter into a bun, smoothing the few strands that refused to obey, then stepped into the locker room where 3 other nurses were already changing into their scrubs. Nobody looked up. Nobody ever did. Her scrubs hung loose on her frame, 2 sizes larger than she needed, soft from 3 years of washing and worn thin at the elbows from leaning across stretchers. The fabric had faded from the original blue-gray to something closer to driftwood, and she preferred it that way. The anonymity of worn things. She moved through the hospital corridors like someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible, her shoes making almost no sound on the tile floor despite the slight limp that came and went depending on the weather. Tonight the pressure was dropping. Her left hip ached with the kind of dull, constant reminder that some injuries never fully healed. She didn't think about why. Thinking about it would require remembering. Seattle General's night shift ran on skeleton crews and the kind of exhaustion that made people forget their own names by hour 4. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. meant Margaret worked the hours when the hospital breathed differently, when the lobby fell silent and the ER operated in a strange liminal space between yesterday's emergencies and tomorrow's catastrophes. The antiseptic smell, bleach and something chemical underneath, like copper washed in industrial soap, had stopped bothering her years ago. It was just the smell of work now. The smell of saving people. Margaret began her rounds at 11:15 p.m., moving through Trauma Bay 3 with the kind of efficiency that came from doing the same thing 10,000 times. She restocked the crash cart without counting, her hands placing each item in its designated spot with mathematical precision. 14-gauge angiocath needles. Silk sutures. Elastic bandages in ascending widths. Her fingers moved with a muscle memory that existed independent of her conscious mind, the same way a musician's fingers find their way across a keyboard in the dark. She had performed these movements in tents. In sandstorms. In rooms lit by nothing but generator-powered lamps and the terrible clarity of knowing that the next 60 seconds would determine whether someone went home or went into the ground. The supply closet on the 2nd floor had become her refuge during breaks. Margaret sat on an overturned crate at 2:15 a.m., folding gauze into perfect military corners, each edge crisp and exact. 23 by 23 centimeters, folded twice, arranged in stacks of 10. The habit persisted even though no one would ever see it. She had tried to break it once, in year 1 of her civilian life, when she realized that perfectly folded gauze packets served no purpose on a hospital shelf. But her hands had refused to learn anything else. Some skills carved themselves into muscle memory so deeply that the conscious mind had no authority over them anymore. The ER doors banged open at 2:16 a.m. with the sudden violence that meant something serious had arrived. Margaret set down her gauze and moved toward the sound, her body responding before her mind caught up. She didn't run, nurses didn't run unless the building was on fire, but her stride lengthened. Her posture changed. The limp vanished. It was the kind of transformation that only lasted until the crisis passed, after which the worn scrubs and graying hair would settle back into place like camouflage. Tension pneumothorax, right side, the paramedic was saying, his hands busy with an oxygen mask as they wheeled the stretcher into Bay 2. Marine from the training facility, hypertension from the minute we got on scene, O2 sat at 82 and falling. We've got no doctor on the floor right now. Skeleton crew. Of course. It was always skeleton crew at this hour, and it was always at this hour that the worst cases arrived. Margaret was already at the stretcher before anyone else had moved, her eyes cataloguing the patient in the way she had learned to do in a single breath. Male, mid-50s, uniform still partially buttoned, face the color of old coins, breathing in short, shallow gasps like a man drowning in air. The right side of his chest barely moved. The left side heaved desperately, his body trying to compensate for a lung that had collapsed, a heart being crushed by air pressure inside the pleural cavity. Sergeant Major Cole. His nameplate was still visible on his uniform. "Get the crash cart," Margaret said. Her voice was quiet. It was always quiet. Chest imaging equipment into the bay, now. The two junior nurses moved without question. They knew her. Not as someone important. Just as someone whose instructions, when given, happened to prevent people from dying. Margaret's hands were already moving. She grabbed the 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart, her fingers so steady they might have been made of titanium. The second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She didn't have to think about it. Her hands already knew. She had done this before, in a convoy medical tent in Tikrit, 15 years ago, using a combat knife and a prayer and the absolute certainty that if she didn't act in the next 30 seconds, the sergeant major under her hands would stop breathing forever. This was different. This was a sterile room. Proper equipment. 20 years of medicine practiced in the normal world instead of the broken world. It should have been easier. It wasn't. O2 sats dropping, someone said. 80. 78. The machine began its panicked escalation of beeps, each sound a clock counting down to cardiac arrest. Margaret pressed the needle through the skin and intercostal muscle with a single confident motion. The hiss of air escaping, a sound like the world exhaling, and suddenly the tension inside the pleural cavity released. She watched the numbers on the monitor begin their slow climb back toward something that resembled survivable. 82. 84. 87. Muscle memory took over. Her hands found the catheter, secured it, and within 90 seconds, Sergeant Major Cole's breathing began to steady. The room went quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that happens after a disaster has been averted by inches. Margaret was already stepping back, already removing the latex gloves that came away with only the smallest tremor, but the tremor was private. Unseen. She had learned 30 years ago that composure was a utility. Like oxygen. Like knowing where the emergency exits were. Like not allowing yourself to remember that you had once held a dying Marine's hand while fire rained down from everywhere and nowhere. That was when the ER doors opened again. Dr. Caldwell walked in like a man who had scheduled his arrival down to the minute, despite the hour being 2:52 a.m. and his inspection schedule listing him as unavailable until 8 a.m. He was tall in the way expensive suits were tailored to create height, his silver hair reflecting the fluorescent lights like they had been positioned specifically to illuminate him. His eyes moved through the room, cataloging everything, assessing every person with the kind of attention that made subordinates nervous. His gaze locked onto Margaret's torn scrubs. The emergency decompression had required movement. Motion. The kind of action that couldn't be performed while maintaining the careful invisibility she had cultivated. Her scrub top had caught on the stretcher rail, creating a tear that had peeled the fabric back just enough. The faded unit patch was visible. The one sewn into the lining of her jacket, hanging in locker 47 downstairs, which had somehow, impossibly, made its way to the surface of her scrubs during the emergency. 2nd Battalion. The same unit. The same unit that had been in Tikrit. The same unit from the medical supply diversion scandal that Dr. Caldwell had buried 6 years ago using paperwork and careful management of who remembered what. His eyes went still. Not blank. Still was different than blank. Still meant he was thinking something very specific, and the specific thought had something to do with why a graying night shift nurse who folded gauze in supply closets during her break somehow bore the unit patch of the 2nd Battalion Marines. Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't break his stare. She simply turned back to the stretcher, her movements becoming even more precise, even more professional, even more completely and totally aligned with the fiction of being just a nurse who had happened to be in the right place at the right moment. The sergeant major's breathing stabilized. His color began its slow return from the gray-white of shock toward something closer to human. The monitor showed the steady rhythm of a man who would survive the night, who would recover, who would walk out of Seattle General in 3 weeks and return to his duty station none the wiser about who had saved his life at 2:48 a.m. on a Tuesday. But Dr. Caldwell hadn't left. He was still standing there, his jaw working slightly as he processed something, his eyes still locked on the space where the patch had been visible for exactly 47 seconds before Margaret's hands had smoothed the fabric back into place. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the overhead page crackled to life, a distraction, a reprieve, something breaking the moment before it could become irreversible. Margaret moved to the next task. The next patient. The next invisible hour of saving lives on a night shift where nobody remembered your name and everyone forgot you existed the moment you clocked out. But she felt Caldwell's presence in the room like pressure. Like the moment before a storm arrives. Like the exact second when someone realizes that what they thought was buried has begun, very quietly, to surface. The overhead page crackled at 6:45 a.m., 15 minutes before shift change. Maggie. The old battle axe. To administration. The entire nursing station went quiet. Then someone snickered. Margaret set down her chart, took one measured breath, and walked to the elevator. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous drone as the doors slid shut, sealing her inside with the reflection of a woman she barely recognized anymore, graying hair, worn scrubs, hands that had held so many lives together they'd forgotten how to tremble. Dr. Caldwell didn't stand when she entered his office. He was already seated, fingers steepled, watching her with the kind of surgical precision usually reserved for scalpels. His desk was walnut. His watch was platinum. Everything about him moved like old money trying to forget it had ever been new. "Sit down, Maggie." She remained standing. He smiled then, a smile like a shark recognizing chum in the water. "Your trauma bay times are concerning. Remarkably fast, actually. Makes me wonder what corners you're cutting." The words came out smooth, reasonable, the kind of voice that could order a firing squad and make it sound like a suggestion. Standard protocols allow 12 to 15 minutes for initial stabilization. "You're consistently under 8. She said nothing. Silence was its own kind of armor. Effective immediately, you're reassigned. He slid a paper across the desk with one finger, pushing it like it might bite. "Weekend nights only. Patient intake and transport. We need fresh energy on weekdays. You understand, I'm sure." He stood then, buttoned his suit jacket with the deliberate slowness of someone who'd practiced dominance in a mirror. "There's another matter. I've been reviewing your employment history. Fascinating gaps. 2004 to 2007, absolutely nothing. No work, no school, no record at all. Then suddenly you appear here with a valid RN license and a spotless reference from somewhere in Virginia I've never heard of." He leaned back against his desk, blocking the door. "That's quite the vanishing act, Maggie." She kept her eyes level. Not defiant. Just present. Just witnessing. "I'm sure you understand hospital policy regarding background verification." His voice dropped, becoming something colder. A voice like a coffin lid closing slowly. "If there are questions about your qualifications, or if you have any curiosity about hospital supply protocols, personnel files, or anything else you might have thought you saw, you keep those questions to yourself. Understood?" He stepped closer. "Because if I hear even a whisper of unfounded accusations from you regarding administration, regarding supply requisitions, regarding anything outside your new scope of work, your license gets flagged. Permanently. RN to unemployable in one phone call." The smell of his cologne was oppressive. Expensive. Like money that had been taught to breathe through fabric. Margaret's hands remained at her sides, palms flat against her thighs. Not trembling. Never trembling. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, a force she'd learned to weaponize in a place where the temperature climbed to 130 degrees and men screamed names they'd forgotten how to pronounce. "Do we have an understanding?" Caldwell's eyes were predatory now, waiting for the collapse he was certain would come. One tear fell. Just one. Clean. Precise. Margaret didn't blink. She reached up and wiped it away with the back of her hand while holding his stare, her jaw set like concrete poured around rebar. When she spoke, her voice was flat. "Cowards always recognize the people who remember." The words hung in the air like a scalpel suspended mid-air. Caldwell's expression flickered, just a fraction of a second, but she saw it. He saw her seeing it. The color of his face shifted, something underneath the expensive grooming trying to surface before he locked it down again. He moved to the door. "You'll start your new assignment tomorrow night. Transport report to the garage by 6 p.m. She walked past him without another word. Down the hallway. Down the elevator. The hospital corridors stretched like the inside of a machine that didn't care which parts it swallowed. 3 nights later, at 10:51 p.m., Caldwell was waiting in the parking lot. October rain was starting, thin and vicious, the kind that found its way through every gap in clothing. Margaret was arriving early for the evening shift, walking from her car with her scrub bag over one shoulder. 8 colleagues were clustered near the entrance, waiting for the night team to brief them out. Caldwell stepped directly into her path, holding a manila folder. His voice carried, deliberately carried, so everyone could hear. "Maggie's moving to patient transport effective immediately. Better suited to her current skill set." He handed her the assignment sheet. His fingers didn't quite touch hers, but the message was intact. Demotion. Exile. A public announcement that she'd been deemed insufficient. A resident whispered to another. Someone's shoulders tensed in sympathy. Caldwell's phone was already out, texting someone as he walked back inside, his movements carrying the casual confidence of a man who'd just neutralized a threat. Margaret looked at the paper in her hands. Transport. Parking lot. No trauma bays. No procedures. No chance to help anyone who mattered. She folded the assignment sheet once, then walked toward the entrance where her colleagues were pretending not to watch. One of the nurses, Chen, a good one who'd worked nights with her for 2 years, caught her eye briefly. There was something in that look. Recognition that what had just happened wasn't about performance metrics or skill gaps. It was punishment disguised as protocol. "I'm going on break," Margaret said to no one in particular, already moving past them. "I need some jello." Chen actually smiled then. A small thing. A thing that meant she understood that humor was sometimes the only weapon left when everything else had been confiscated. Margaret found the break room empty, the fluorescent lights casting everything in a color that didn't exist in nature. She sat at the table for exactly 4 minutes, staring at the assignment sheet without reading it. Transport. Patient movement. The job of someone who wasn't trusted with the sharp instruments or the critical decisions. She'd held men's ribs open with her bare hands in a place where the heat made the sand shimmer like water. She'd sutured arterial bleeds by moonlight and kept 3 soldiers breathing with a hand pump and shear will when the medevac was 40 minutes out. And now she couldn't be trusted with a trauma bay. The rain was heavier when she left the break room. By the time she made it to her new assignment location in the parking garage, a desk, actually, positioned to monitor patient transport requests, her scrubs were soaked and her hair was plastered against her neck. She sat in a chair that was older than her career and waited for the first transport request that wouldn't come until midnight. What she didn't know was that her world was about to splinter. What she didn't know was that saving a sergeant major's life had been the exact wrong thing to do at the exact right moment, and that sometimes the bravest act you commit is the one that changes everything before you understand what's changing. What she didn't know was that 4 hours from now, a Marine would be wheeled into Seattle General with a tension pneumothorax that would require someone with hands that remembered exactly how to save him. The reassignment notice was waiting in her locker Thursday morning, printed on hospital letterhead and signed by 3 names. Margaret Walsh. Weekend graveyard shift. Effective immediately. Trauma bay access, restricted pending competency review. Patient transport and discharge documentation, approved duties. The paper felt thin between her fingers, almost weightless for something so carefully designed to erase her. She read it twice. She didn't need to. The message was written in what Caldwell had deliberately omitted, no reason given, no suspension date listed, just a slow suffocation disguised as administrative protocol. By Friday evening, before her first weekend shift, security barriers had been installed at both trauma bay entrances. Margaret watched from the hallway as 2 guards, young men in grey uniforms who wouldn't meet her eyes, received their briefing from a supervisor carrying a clipboard. The supervisor pointed toward the ER, then toward Margaret's usual station near the supply room. She didn't hear the words, but she understood the gesture perfectly. The systematic construction of her irrelevance was almost architectural in its precision. Caldwell had positioned himself 3 floors above, making phone calls, signing documents, never needing to raise his voice or acknowledge her directly. That was the mark of a predator who understood institutional power. He didn't hunt with rage, he hunted with administrative procedure. The clipboard supervisor approached her on Saturday at 11 p.m., the start of her new weekend assignment. His name tag read Patterson. His voice carried the apologetic tone of a man following orders he didn't fully understand. Ms. Walsh, Dr. Caldwell's directive is that ground floor access only for the foreseeable future. You're assigned to parking lot patient intake and discharge documentation. That's your primary responsibility going forward. Margaret nodded once, said nothing. The silence between them stretched like a rubber band pulled too tight. Patterson shifted his weight. He was waiting for something, a question, a protest, even tears. Nurses sometimes cried in supply closets when reassignments came through. Margaret simply folded the directive and placed it in her scrub pocket. Patterson left, relieved and unsettled in equal measure. She understood what Caldwell had engineered with the precision of a man who'd been planning this for 3 days. Sergeant Major Cole had been moved. She confirmed it by checking the system on her personal phone during a break, logging in just long enough to see his record flagged with a military hold and transferred to Naval Hospital Bremerton 42 miles north. The 2 residents who'd been in that trauma bay had been reassigned to pediatric rotations with no explanation. The surgical team that might have testified to her competence had been scattered like chess pieces swept from a board. Caldwell wasn't just removing her from the hospital's operating theater. He was erasing the witnesses who could testify that she'd performed a procedure that saved a life, erasing the evidence that a night shift nurse could move and think and act with the kind of precision that belonged to someone with military training. Parking lot patient intake meant sitting at a desk near the ambulance bay, clipboard in hand, processing discharge paperwork for patients being transported home or to follow-up care facilities. The work was clerical, invisible, the kind of task that could be performed by someone with a high school diploma and clerical training. Margaret sat at that desk and processed 73 discharge forms over her Saturday night shift while people she'd worked beside for 3 years passed her desk without stopping, their eyes carefully trained forward. She could taste the metallic edge of it, not humiliation anymore, something older and more clinical. Strategic removal. Caldwell had learned from 6 years ago in Tikrit that direct confrontation created witnesses. Quiet erasure left no one to testify about what they'd seen. Sunday morning brought inventory counts in the supply closet, a task normally assigned to new hires. Margaret counted bandages, syringes, 4 bags, and catheter kits with the focus of someone performing surgery. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, making marks on the electronic inventory system. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical song above her head, indifferent to whether she was saving a life or counting gauze pads. A younger nurse named Katie stopped by the supply closet doorway around 2 a.m. Katie had been on the shift when the sergeant major came in. She'd watched Margaret work for 3 minutes before Caldwell arrived. Katie was carrying empty specimen containers and looked like she wanted to say something. Margaret didn't make eye contact. The kindness of potential allies was sometimes more dangerous than Caldwell's calculated indifference. Katie set the containers down and left without speaking. The pattern became clear by her 3rd weekend shift. Wednesday nights were different. The hospital operated on a skeleton crew, just 2 physicians on call, a handful of nurses, no attending surgeons in-house. The trauma bays sat empty like waiting mouths. Caldwell had positioned his guard specifically at those times, when Margaret's absence from the trauma teams would be most conspicuous. He was making a statement without words, even at night, even when no other options existed. You will not be called. You will not be trusted. You will not be useful. It was brilliant in its cruelty because it was entirely defensible in writing. She'd been reassigned to administrative duties. She had no trauma credentials on her file. There were no written orders to prevent her from entering the bays, just standing guards and Caldwell's whispered word moving through the administrative infrastructure like smoke. Thursday evening, she checked her access badge at the terminal near the ER, a habit from 3 years of night shifts. Temporary credential suspension, the screen read. Pending competency review. Access to trauma and surgical services, denied. She stared at the words. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench visibly. She turned and walked back to the parking lot, where the rain had started again, the kind of rain that fell in Jacksonville like the sky was trying to wash something away but never quite managing it. Her phone buzzed at 1:36 a.m. Friday morning. She was in the employee break room, sitting alone with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The message was from the hospital's emergency alert system, automated, clinical, devoid of any human inflection, mass casualty alert, motor vehicle accident, marine convoy training exercises, multiple patients GSW and blunt trauma, ETA 12 minutes. All available surgical staff report immediately. She knew before her feet moved. She knew before she stood. She knew before the adrenaline started its familiar climb, the sensation that belonged to a body that had been trained for exactly this scenario and hadn't forgotten one moment of the training in 3 years of pretending to be someone smaller. The message repeated once, ETA 12 minutes. On-call surgeon, Dr. Elena Vasquez, 30 minutes out from home, traffic dependent. The math was simple. 12 minutes for multiple casualties to arrive. 30 minutes for the only surgeon on contract to actually be in the building. Margaret was already moving toward the ER entrance when her radio crackled, the staff coordinator, voice tight, calling for all available medical personnel to trauma reception. The security guard stepped into her path like a wall made of gray uniform and apologetic instructions. His name tag read Henderson. He was new, probably in his mid-20s, and he'd been given clear orders about which nurse was not to enter the trauma bays under any circumstances. Margaret stopped 3 feet in front of him. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply looked at him with the eyes of someone who'd been in a forward operating base in Iraq when a mortar round came through the surgical tent and everyone there had learned in the space of 6 seconds what it meant to prioritize. The on-call surgeon is 30 minutes out, she said quietly. 12 minutes until multiple casualties arrive. If you block this door, people will die. Henderson's radio crackled with Caldwell's voice, tight and deliberate. Code red security protocol. No entry without Dr. Caldwell's direct authorization. Maintain your position. Henderson's hand moved instinctively to his radio. He looked young. He looked like someone who'd been given an assignment and was trying to execute it properly. Margaret didn't move. She didn't push past him. She simply stood there, present, immovable, waiting. Behind her, the ER doors opened and Dr. Caldwell appeared, phone already to his ear, his presence making the air pressure change like the moment before a thunderstorm arrives. He was wearing scrubs even though he'd been called from off-site, prepared, controlled, exactly where he'd strategically positioned himself to ensure he would arrive just in time to prevent Margaret from entering. He ended his call. He looked at Margaret with the particular expression of someone who'd just confirmed that all the pieces of his plan had fallen into alignment. The sergeant major was gone. The residents who'd witnessed her competence were scattered. She'd been reassigned to parking lot administration, her credentials restricted, her access denied. And now, at the exact moment when any rational person would expect her to be called into a medical crisis, there was a guard standing between her and the door. Ms. Walsh, Caldwell said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, low and threatening without needing to increase volume. You're not cleared for trauma response. Your reassignment is to patient transport and discharge documentation. That hasn't changed. Margaret looked at the door. She looked at Henderson. She looked at Caldwell. Her coffee cup was still in her right hand. The rain outside had turned violent, hammering against the windows like applause for something that hadn't happened yet. She didn't set the coffee cup down. She didn't argue about her credentials or her training or her capability. She simply spoke 5 words, the kind of words that take years of discipline to deploy with absolutely no emotion underneath them. "I need to use the bathroom." Henderson's expression flickered, uncertainty, apology, a moment of human recognition that people use bathrooms and that standing guard over a nurse's bladder was not the assignment he thought he had. He stepped aside slightly. Not completely. Just enough. Margaret walked past him toward the staff facilities, moving with the unhurried gait of someone who had nowhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. She heard Caldwell's phone ring. She heard him answer with the assured voice of a man whose plans had worked perfectly. She heard him say, "Yes, I've restricted her from the trauma bays. No, she won't be involved in treatment. I've ensured complete isolation." She reached the bathroom. She waited 60 seconds. Then she removed her scrub slowly, deliberately, the fabric making soft sounds as it peeled away from her damp skin. Under her scrubs, beneath the oversized gray shirt she wore to conceal anything that might hint at who she'd been before Jacksonville, a unit patch was sewn into the waistband of her athletic shorts. A faded 2nd Battalion patch, the kind soldiers carried like holy relics, the kind of object that meant nothing to a doctor in Jacksonville and everything to someone who'd held lives together with field thoracotomy kits and prayers whispered in languages Caldwell would never speak. She dressed again. She pushed open the bathroom door. The ER was in controlled chaos. Paramedics were already arriving with the first patient, a young Marine with a mangled left femur and blast injuries across his torso, GSW to the left anterior chest. The trauma team was moving with the practiced efficiency of people trained for this, but there were only 4 of them, and they'd all been called from off-service rotations. Dr. Caldwell was in Trauma Bay 1, already calling for blood products, for the Level 1 rapid infuser, for a 14-gauge angiocath needle and 2 liters of normal saline to run simultaneously. The on-call surgeon was still 17 minutes away. The 2nd ambulance was being unloaded. The 3rd was arriving behind it. Margaret stood at the nursing station and watched the math happen in real time, bodies arriving faster than experienced hands could process them. Caldwell glanced up. He saw her. His expression didn't change. He simply turned back to the patient and continued working, a man entirely confident that the boundaries he'd drawn would hold because he'd positioned her so far outside the system that she couldn't cross them even if she tried. But Margaret wasn't looking at him anymore. She was watching the 2nd bay, where a young resident was starting an 4 on a trauma patient without adequate monitoring, without the kind of precision that came from having done this 1,000 times under fire. She could see the problem from the nursing station. She could see exactly what would happen in 4 minutes if that line infiltrated and the blood product started flooding into the subcutaneous tissue instead of the vein. She could see the clock. 12 minutes until total blood loss would exceed viable recovery. 12 minutes and counting. The Humvee convoy rolled into the emergency circle at 11:13 p.m., and Margaret Walsh didn't hesitate. She was in the parking lot, waiting for transport, when the radio crackled, mass casualty alert, multiple GSW, training accident gone wrong, on-call surgeon 30 minutes out. She heard it from the loading dock. Heard the tires on wet asphalt. Heard the doors slamming open like commands. The security guard Caldwell had stationed at the trauma bay entrance didn't even look up when she walked past him. "Write me up later," she said. That was all. Not a request. Not an apology. A statement of fact, delivered in a voice that had learned how to issue orders in places where hesitation meant bodies in the street. The guard stepped aside. Trauma 1 smelled like diesel fuel and fresh blood. The first Marine was already on the table, chest wound, no pulse, skin the color of old paper. The resident was frozen, hands trembling above the crash cart, staring at the wound like it might explain itself. 2 nurses tried to establish for access in unresponsive limbs. 8 minutes. That's all the calculation Margaret needed. 8 minutes before cardiac death became irreversible, before this young Marine's mother got a folded flag and a ceremony instead of her son. Margaret grabbed a 15-blade scalpel from the crash cart. Her hands moved without instruction from her brain, muscle memory like scar tissue, dense and automatic. She opened his chest in one decisive motion, the blade parting skin and ribs with the same controlled pressure she'd used on a lieutenant colonel in Fallujah 12 years ago. The resident gasped. One of the nurses stepped back. Margaret didn't look at them. She wasn't in Jacksonville anymore. She was in Tikrit, in a forward operating base with no anesthesia and no time, with a combat knife and a man bleeding out and nothing between him and death except her hands. "Retractors," she said. "Not please." "Not could someone." Command voice, flat and certain. A resident scrambled to position the retractor. Blood pooled in the chest cavity, it's dark, heavy, moving like a tide. Margaret's left hand entered the cavity, fingers finding the left ventricle through muscle memory encoded in 10,000 hours of field medicine. The right hand began manual cardiac massage, pumping the heart directly, her knuckles compressing the organ with the rhythm of someone who had done this before with a flashlight and a dying man's wife praying in a language Margaret didn't understand but recognized everywhere. 2 units O negative, push them now, Margaret said. The 4 line wasn't fast enough. She didn't say this. The residents understood anyway. One of them moved to grab blood from the crash cart cooler. Suction. I need to see the left anterior descending. The junior resident fumbled with a suction catheter. His hand shook. Margaret's didn't. She found the artery, traced it with her index finger inside a man's open chest, felt the arterial tear where shrapnel would have been, except this was a training accident and the damage was clean. Fixable. Survivable if she worked fast enough. 18 minutes. That's what the clock said when the 2nd Marine's heart resumed its own rhythm. Sinus rhythm on the monitor, not a flat line, not fibrillation, not the irregular chaos of a dying system. A steady, stable beat. 84 per minute. The resident who'd been frozen was crying now. One of the nurses whispered something that might have been a prayer or might have been gratitude. Margaret didn't stop. The second trauma case was arriving, rolled through the doors on a stretcher, another Marine with an abdominal wound that had bled him pale. She was elbow deep in the second patient's cavity when Dr. Caldwell arrived. He came through the doors at 12:14 a.m. with 2 hospital security officers and the expression of a man whose strategic calculation had just died on a table in front of 12 witnesses. His eyes found Margaret's, not the timid nurse in worn scrubs, not the woman who'd accepted his demotions in silence, but someone else. Someone whose hands moved like she'd written this particular surgery 1,000 times in 1,000 operating theaters that nobody in Jacksonville had ever heard of. He didn't raise his voice. That was the thing about Caldwell, he never needed to. His voice was the sound of a man secure in his power, precise as a scalpel, surgical in its cruelty. Margaret Walsh, you're terminated effective immediately. Insubordination. Practicing beyond your scope. Violating direct orders. Leave the building. The residents froze mid-motion. One of them opened his mouth to speak. Caldwell didn't even glance at him. Security, escort her out. His phone was already in his hand. He was already walking, already dialing, already prepared for the nuclear option he'd been holding in reserve. The first call went to the State Medical Board. Margaret heard it while she was washing her hands, while the second Marine was being wheeled to the ICU with a fighting chance at living past dawn. Caldwell stood in the hallway, voice calm and damning. Yes, this is Dr. James Caldwell, Chief of Emergency Services at Seattle General. I need to file a formal complaint regarding an RN on staff. Dangerous unauthorized procedures. Patient endangerment. Yes, I'll hold the line. The hold music played. He didn't hang up. Margaret dried her hands with the precision she'd once used for ceremony. The second call was to HR. She heard this one while walking toward the exit, the security officer flanking her like she was a violent offender. Caldwell was already 3 steps ahead, shepherding himself into administration, his voice never wavering. Yes, this is Dr. Caldwell again. I need Margaret Walsh's personnel file flagged system-wide. Do not permit transfer of employment records. Do not provide references. She will not be working in health care again. No, I don't need to explain the details on an open line. He smiled at Margaret as she passed. Not a smile of triumph. A smile of accomplished erasure. But that wasn't the worst part. Upstairs, Sergeant Major Cole had been moved to a secure military facility 42 miles away, Caldwell's insurance policy, his final isolation. But Cole wasn't sedated. He'd heard the commotion through the grapevine that only wounded Marines know how to access, the whispered network of phones and visitors and orderlies who remembered. He'd gotten out of bed, arm still in a sling, and called someone, not a friend, not family, but the kind of someone you call when you owe a debt and need to spend it fast. NCIS. He reported the escalating interference by the hospital. The sudden restriction of the woman who'd saved his life. The pattern of sabotage that didn't make sense unless someone was hiding something. Within 20 minutes, MPs arrived at Seattle General. Caldwell met them, spoke quietly, gestured toward Margaret. They nodded. Cole was transported out of Jacksonville in the back of a military vehicle, removed from the facility entirely, his intervention neutralized before it could begin. Strategic isolation, complete. At 2:53 a.m., Margaret stood alone in the hospital laundry room. The industrial dryer hummed behind her, a sound like the world continuing without her in it. She folded her scrubs with the precision she'd once used for dress blues, the movements economical and perfect, each crease placed with the kind of care that only soldiers understand. The fabric was still warm from the dryer, soft from 1,000 washings, carrying the smell of industrial bleach and her own sweat and the blood that never quite came out, even after 2 decades of trying. She folded the top last, the scrub top that had torn when the unit patch showed through, when Caldwell's eyes had found her military history written on linen. Her thumb moved across the place where the embroidery would have been visible, where the 2nd Battalion insignia had pressed against her skin like a secret she'd carried long enough. She set the stack on the counter with the kind of ceremony you reserve for funerals. Removed her badge. Placed it on top. The overhead lights buzzed their fluorescent hum, indifferent to the fact that they were watching the end of her career, the dissolution of the identity she'd spent 3 years building. She didn't cry. She'd learned in Tikrit that crying was a luxury for people with time to spare, and Margaret Walsh had spent her lifetime running low. The Humvee convoy rolled into the hospital circle at dawn, dust still settling on the tarmac like smoke after artillery. A Marine colonel stepped out first, dress blues sharp enough to cut glass, silver oak leaves catching the pale Jacksonville light. He walked directly toward the service exit where Margaret was leaving, her final uniform folded inside a paper bag she'd taken from the supply closet. His voice carried across the entire loading dock, loud enough that orderlies froze mid-motion and a nurse dropping off laundry cart stopped cold. Major Margaret Walsh. Not a question. A rank announcement. The way you call someone home after they've been missing for 6 years. The entire loading dock heard it. 3 security guards turned. 2 maintenance workers stood still. A hospital administrator emerged from the back hallway, coffee cup suspended halfway to her mouth. Margaret's hand tightened on the paper bag. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn around immediately. She took one more breath, the kind you take before walking into rooms where people are dying, and turned to face the voice that had just unmade 3 years of invisibility in 4 words. Dr. Caldwell emerged from the administration corridor behind her, his face rearranging itself in real time like a mask being fitted over something raw underneath. The damage control smile appeared first, the one reserved for hospital boards and donor galas. But his eyes had already emptied. They looked like windows of a house being foreclosed, nobody home, everything being moved out. He walked toward the colonel, his hand extended in the posture of someone trying to salvage a social situation that was already burning. "Colonel, I'm not sure there's been some kind of misunderstanding." The colonel didn't shake his hand. Instead, he opened a tablet he'd been holding, the screen angled so Margaret could see it clearly. Her Silver Star citation from Tikrit filled the display. Combat field medicine under direct fire. 23 wounded treated in a 40-minute window. 2 lives saved that would have been lost without immediate intervention. The citation listed her by rank and full name, and underneath it, 3 separate commendations for advanced surgical training conducted in active theater. Then another document. Classified designation, medic trainer, 2nd Battalion role, focused on training surgical units in field protocols. Margaret's hands had done that work. Margaret's hands had trained other people to save lives in places where the dust still smelled like copper and diesel and burning fuel. Caldwell's face had gone the color of old hospital walls, institutional beige, the color of something that's been scrubbed too many times and lost all its original detail. The colonel's voice remained level, conversational, the way officers talk when they're destroying someone's entire constructed world. When Sergeant Major Cole arrived in your emergency room 6 days ago with a tension pneumothorax, Major Walsh performed a field thoracotomy that saved his life. He recognized her immediately upon arrival. He knew exactly who she was. Caldwell's jaw tightened. You could see the muscle move beneath his skin like something trying to escape. When he noticed the escalating interference with her work assignments, her access restrictions, the systematic isolation from trauma procedures, he contacted NCIS directly. That was 48 hours ago. The colonel gestured to a captain standing behind him, uniform sharp as a knife edge. The captain didn't speak. He just held a folder. The weight of it seemed to make the air heavier. When you filed a complaint with the State Medical Board yesterday morning, trying to permanently revoke Major Walsh's nursing license based on allegations of practicing beyond her scope during a mass casualty event, you triggered an automatic federal review protocol. The colonel paused. The pause lasted long enough that Margaret could hear the hospital's ventilation system humming through the walls, a sound like the breath of something very large and very patient. Any inquiry into the background of military medical personnel automatically notifies NCIS and prompts a security audit of the requesting institution. The hospital administrator had materialized now, standing near the entrance to the loading dock, her phone already pressed to her ear. She was saying words Margaret could almost hear, legal and immediately and no further action without counsel. But the captain spoke, and his voice cut through her phone call like a scalpel through scar tissue. Federal auditors are arriving in 20 minutes, Dr. Caldwell. They're here to examine Seattle General's controlled substance requisition logs. Caldwell didn't respond. He couldn't. His body had gone rigid, the way prey animals go still when they realize the predator has seen them. The colonel continued, and his tone had shifted now, not threatening, just stating facts the way a prosecutor states facts in a courtroom where the verdict is already written. When NCIS pulled Seattle General's records, they discovered irregularities in controlled medication requisition spanning 6 years. We found the same signature pattern, the same routing methodology, the same black market distributor connections that were documented in a 2005 investigation in Tikrit that was never fully resolved. The colonel held up the tablet again. Medical supply requisition forms filled the screen. Caldwell's signature, the distinctive triple initial loop pattern he developed in Iraq, distinctive enough that handwriting analysis could match it across years and continents, appeared on every single form. Morphine. Fentanyl. Controlled sedatives. All of it routed through the same phantom vendor accounts. All of it signed by the same hands. The specific requisition protocol you used in Tikrit, Doctor, you're the only person who still uses it. The colonel's voice had become the voice of something that has already won and is simply documenting the victory. You used it in Iraq, routing medications to black market distributors operating in Fallujah and Tikrit. And according to NCIS records, you've been using it here for 6 years. $17,000 per month in controlled medications, minimum. That's over $12 million, Doctor. Caldwell's phone began vibrating in his pocket. Margaret could see his hand move toward it, then stop, frozen halfway. The captain's eyes tracked the movement. Just the eyes. That's all it took to communicate that touching that phone would be a significantly bad decision. Margaret spoke for the first time since the colonel arrived. Her voice was quiet, not whispered, just quiet, the way you speak in rooms where people are dying and you need them to hear you despite the machines around them. I didn't connect it until I saw your signature on the controlled med logs last week. She kept her hand steady, though the paper bag containing her folded scrubs had become very heavy in her grip. I was processing supply inventory as part of my transport duties. The medication counts didn't match the patient charts. So I cross-referenced the requisition signatures. She paused. Her eyes met his. The triple initial pattern. You use it exactly the same way. Tikrit. 2005, Seattle General. 2018 through now. You never changed it, Doctor. You never even tried to hide it. Caldwell turned on her, and for just a moment, his face became something else entirely, not controlled, not strategic, something raw underneath. You had no right, the captain interrupted, his voice like a closing door. She had every right, and her attempt to silence her, isolate her from patient care, and destroy her professional credentials is now documented witness intimidation. 3 federal vehicles were pulling into the hospital circle now, their arrival announced by the sound of their engines shifting into park, a sound like dominoes settling. Agents in windbreakers began emerging, men and women moving with the fluid certainty of apex predators, the kind of certainty that comes from knowing exactly where every threat in the room is located. The hospital administrator had hung up her phone and was holding her hands up slightly, a universal gesture that translated to, "I am cooperating and everything about this is above my pay grade." The residents who'd been reassigned away from the trauma bays were already being escorted into the administration office. The security guard who'd stood at the trauma bay entrance, the one Caldwell had positioned there to keep Margaret out, was having a quiet conversation with a federal agent. His face suggested this was not a conversation he was enjoying. Every strategic move Caldwell had made, every phone call, every reassignment, every careful notation, had been documented. His competence, his planning, the layers of institutional protection he'd built, all of it had become evidence. It was like watching someone's entire carefully constructed fortress collapse inward, not from an external assault, but from the weight of its own architecture finally becoming too much to bear. They walked Caldwell toward the federal vehicle with a kind of courtesy that was somehow worse than aggression. His hands weren't restrained. Nobody was touching him. But 3 agents surrounded him in a formation that made escape geometrically impossible. His lawyer was apparently already en route, Margaret could hear him saying so, his voice the voice of someone whose day had just become significantly more expensive and significantly less winnable. Caldwell looked back once as they reached the vehicle. Once. His eyes found Margaret's across the loading dock, across the space where she'd been demoted and humiliated and fired, where she'd stood and taken it all without breaking. Their eyes met. She didn't look away. She held his gaze the way you hold a patient's eyes when they're terrified and you need them to understand that you will not abandon them, except in this case the message was inverted. I will not forget. I will not pretend this didn't happen. I will not become small enough to fit into the world you tried to make me. The agent opened the vehicle door. Caldwell got in. The door closed with the sound of institutional finality. And Margaret Walsh, Major, United States Marine Corps, stood on the loading dock in Jacksonville holding a paper bag with her last pair of folded scrubs and watched the federal motorcade disappear toward the interstate. 2 years later, her office occupied the top floor of a Pentagon building, the kind of space that overlooked Arlington Cemetery where the grass was the green of perpetual remembrance. Her desk held a nameplate, Major Margaret Walsh, Director, Marine Corps Civilian Military Medical Liaison Program. The oak leaves on her collar caught the light the way oak leaves do when they've been earned in rooms without cameras and on nights without witnesses. Her program trained emergency physicians in combat protocols, building the bridge between military trauma care and civilian emergency medicine, taking the lessons learned in places like Tikrit and Fallujah and teaching them to surgeons who'd never heard a round impact a building. On her wall hung the faded unit patch, the 2nd Battalion insignia, carefully removed from her scrubs that final night in the laundry room when she'd still believed her career was ending. Now it was framed beside her silver star and her 3 commendations, all of them restored and publicly displayed. Beside that frame hung a photograph from Seattle General's loading dock, the exact moment the colonel had said her rank aloud, the instant when the entire world shifted. The diversion scheme had netted 17 other arrests across 3 states. Federal prosecutors were still building cases in 2 additional cities where Caldwell's signature pattern appeared in hospital records going back 8 years. Seattle General established the Walsh Protocol, mandatory background verification for personnel with military service history, preventing the retaliation she'd endured, protecting the ones coming after her. The hospital had hired her back, publicly and with apologies, but she declined. Some rooms become too small once you've remembered who you actually are. Margaret's phone buzzed on her desk. A Marine captain on the other end, voice urgent, incoming trauma case, civilian hospital in San Diego, mass casualty incident. They needed her expertise on the ground. Her go bag was already packed. It was always packed. She grabbed it from the closet, ran through the Pentagon parking lot toward the waiting helicopter, a Black Hawk with Night Stalker markings, the kind of helicopter that makes a sound like controlled thunder. On the drive to the landing zone, she passed a strip mall in Arlington. A folding table sat outside a supplemental insurance office. Someone in a cheap suit was arranging pamphlets. Margaret didn't slow down. Some people become the background. At the San Diego emergency room, a young nurse, former Army medic, recently hired, was being dressed down by an attending for moving too fast during a trauma assessment, for being too confident, for not waiting for explicit permission before acting. The attending's face was the face of someone whose authority had been questioned. Margaret walked in, introduced herself by rank and program, and watched the attending's expression collapse like a building with the supports removed. She pulled the nurse aside afterward, in the hallway where the fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical hymn. "They'll try to make you small," Margaret said quietly. "Smaller than you are. Quieter than you need to be. Don't let them." The nurse noticed Margaret's unit patch on her go bag. "How do you deal with people who don't understand what we've done?" Margaret's voice was steady, certain, the voice of someone who'd walked through fire and came out the other side still herself. "You don't shrink. You don't hide. You don't apologize for knowing things." She took a breath. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. She walked into the trauma bay, where a critical patient waited on a stretcher, where the machines beeped their urgent protocols, where the work of saving lives demanded her hands and her knowledge and everything she'd survived to protect. Her hands moved with that precision that comes from muscle memory and Tikrit and 3 years of invisibility and the moment when a colonel said her rank aloud in a loading dock in Jacksonville. She didn't hesitate. She never hesitated anymore. If this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who you actually were, like this video and subscribe for more stories about people who refuse to become invisible. Comment below, have you ever been judged by your appearance only to prove someone dead wrong? These are the stories we need to hear.